Manjali Kamath. This Sunday marked the 5th anniversary of Hurricane Katrina. Early in the morning of August 29, 2005, the storm slammed into the Gulf Coast just south of New Orleans. It ravaged the coasts of Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama and left over 1,800 people dead. 80% of the city of New Orleans was underwater after the levees failed. President Obama visited New Orleans on Sunday and said that the construction of a fortified levee system to protect the city is underway. He called it a, quote, a natural disaster, but also a man-made catastrophe, a shameful breakdown in government that left countless men and women and children abandoned and alone. Well, we begin today's show with a new documentary that gets the inside story of why the destruction of New Orleans was an unnatural disaster and how it could have been prevented. The Big Uneasy is a feature-length film by actor and satirist Harry Shearer. Here are some excerpts.
We all know what happened to New Orleans on August 29th, 2005. Katrina.
The biggest natural disaster.
Katrina was a natural disaster.
A major American city went through a natural disaster.
Unlike Katrina, where you had a natural disaster.
Katrina, the hurricane, did so much damage in New Orleans.
This natural disaster befell New Orleans.
And yes, it's true, the Mississippi Gulf Coast did suffer devastating damage from a hurricane that day. But as a part-time resident of New Orleans, I became aware over the weeks and months that followed the flood, as did everybody else here, that there was a very different side to that story.
We know that Katrina was about a 1 in 30 to 1 in 40 year storm.
In fact, New Orleans proper likely experienced only Category 1 or Category 2 conditions.
This is contrary to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, who are trying to claim that Katrina was a
1 in 496 probability of occurrence.
The Army Corps generals came out in their green suits and immediately said that
that was a big storm.
The reason they're doing that is to cover their behinds.
And you can't out-engineer Mother Nature.
Part of their defense was this was a humongous storm.
Katrina was a storm that was, until then, unimaginable.
There would obviously be no oversight of the Corps of Engineers and their operations. And as we dug deeper, we found clerical errors, we found misinterpretation of data, misscribing data, as we look from breach to breach. The kind of mistake at the London Avenue breach is what you learn about in second-year engineering.
There was one contractor who, in fact, went to court because he did not believe the flood wall he was building could hold in front of a storm, and he wanted the Corps to do it right.
The contractor, Pittman Construction, told the Corps of Engineers that the soil and the foundation for the walls were not of sufficient strength, rigidity, and stability.
He went to court. The Corps fought him and won, and he was compelled to build as designed, which he did, and it failed.
The design of those walls were based upon a standard hurricane coming through. The Hurricane Katrina was much larger than what the walls were designed for.
In many locations, levees were built at 10 feet when they should have been at 14 feet. They had new model data available to them from 1979 onwards that they ignored.
The intensity of this storm simply exceeded the design capacity of this levee.
This was not a natural disaster. In fact, this was a very unnatural disaster. This was a disaster caused by people. Following the release of our report, we've had 3 things coming back. Attaboy, go for it, keep it up. The other one, deadly silence. And the third one, please shut up.
Excerpts from The Big Uneasy, a documentary by Harry Shearer that is playing tonight in theaters across the country. Actor, writer, satirist, musician, director, and part-time New Orleans resident Harry Shearer, the voice of many characters in The Simpsons, joins me now from New Orleans. Welcome to Democracy Now! Explain why you decided to make this film.
Really very simple proximate cause. I was watching President Obama's town hall meeting here last October, and when he referred to the flooding of New Orleans as a natural disaster, some 3 years after these 2 independent investigative forensic engineering reports had been issued, which agreed that this was a man-made disaster. In one case, the quote from the UC Berkeley people is the greatest man-made engineering catastrophe since Chernobyl. When the president called it a natural disaster, I realized that what New Orleans knew, the rest of the country didn't, that New Orleans had basically lost control of the narrative of its own near destruction. And I thought one way to try to get it back was to do a factual feature-length documentary.
And what did you think of President Obama's comments yesterday? He called it a natural disaster again, but he also said it's a man-made catastrophe.
A man-made catastrophe related to the leaving people abandoned, referring to the government failure in the response. That's exactly the same language he used last October. He refuses to acknowledge that an agency of the federal government, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, under administrations of both parties over 4.5 decades, is, as the Corps has itself admitted, of course the head of the Corps who admitted that was no longer head of the Corps within a few months, but that the Corps was culpable for this disaster. Ray Seed of the University of California Berkeley team says clearly, it's the first scene in my film, that had the right kind of hurricane protection been offered to New Orleans, the worst Hurricane Katrina would have done to New Orleans is, quote, wet ankles. If the president doesn't acknowledge that, then we have no hope of getting this thing done right this time.
Well, I want to go to a clip. President Obama and the Army Corps of Engineers promised that a new flood prevention system that will protect against the worst storm in the next 100 years